My name is Olivia. I'm 33 years old. And 4 months ago, I sat in a courtroom and signed a single-page settlement agreement that gave my husband's family the house I had lived in for 8 years. My mother-in-law, Patricia, was sitting 2 rows behind me. I heard her laugh. Not loudly, just enough. The specific, satisfied laugh of a woman who believed she had finally won something she'd been fighting for since the day I moved in. She had no idea what she'd actually won. Because 8 years earlier, when that house was 12 days from foreclosure and everyone in the Whitfield family was too busy arguing about whose fault it was to actually fix it, I was the one who fixed it. And being the kind of person I am, the kind of person whose job it is to read documents other people don't bother reading, I made sure that fact was recorded. Permanently. At the county courthouse. Attached to the property itself. Patricia laughed in that courtroom because she thought she'd taken the house from me. What she didn't know was that the house came with something attached to it. Something I'd put there myself, 8 years ago, and never removed. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where we tell quiet stories about people who did the right thing once, documented it properly, and then watched that single piece of paperwork outlast an entire marriage. If you've ever been the only person in a family who reads the fine print, this one is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Hit subscribe so the next one finds you. Let me take you back 8 years, to the first time I walked into that house, and the first thing my mother-in-law ever said to me inside it. Before I tell you about the courtroom, you need to understand the Whitfield family and the house on Maple Street, because the house was never just a house. It was the family's entire personality. The house had been built by Connor's grandfather, a contractor, back when the neighborhood was still mostly farmland. 3 generations of Whitfields had lived in it. Patricia had grown up in it, raised Connor and his sister in it, and when Connor's father passed away, Patricia moved into a smaller condo across town, and Connor, as the older child, took over the house. I should tell you what I do for a living, because it matters for everything that comes after. I'm a title examiner. I've worked at a title company for almost 10 years, which means my entire job is reading property records. Deeds, mortgages, liens, easements, the recorded history of who owns what and who owes what on it. It's not glamorous. Most people don't know it's a job that exists, but it means I spend my days reading the documents that everyone else signs without reading. I met Connor through mutual friends a year after his father died. He was kind, in the specific exhausted way of someone who just inherited a house, a mortgage, and a mother who had opinions about both. We dated for a year and got married the year after that, and I moved into the house on Maple Street 3 weeks before the wedding, because Connor's lease was up and it made sense. The first time Patricia gave me a tour of her house, the one she'd technically already moved out of, she walked me through every room with the specific proprietary energy of someone showing a hotel guest where the towels were. In the kitchen, she ran her hand along the countertop, the original one from when Connor's grandfather built the place, and she said without quite looking at me, "Don't get too comfortable, dear. This house belongs to the Whitfields. You're just visiting." She said it lightly. Almost like a joke. The kind of joke that isn't. I want to be honest. I didn't think much of it at the time. People say things at family gatherings that sound worse in retrospect than they did in the moment, and I filed it away the way you file away a comment from someone you're going to spend a lot of holidays with and have decided, for the sake of peace, not to keep score of. I wish I'd started keeping score earlier. It would have saved me some time. But it wouldn't have changed the ending, because the thing that actually mattered, the thing that ended up being the whole story, hadn't happened yet. It happened 18 months into the marriage. Connor's father, it turned out, had not managed the house's finances well in his last years. He'd taken out a second mortgage to cover medical bills nobody had told the rest of the family about, and by the time anyone looked closely at the numbers, the house was 3 months behind on payments and 12 days from a foreclosure notice becoming final. Connor found out on a Tuesday. He came home from work and sat at the kitchen table, the same counter Patricia had run her hand along, and put his head down and told me everything. The second mortgage. The arrears. The letter from the bank that he'd been too afraid to open for 2 weeks, which is how it had gotten to 12 days instead of 60. He told me he didn't know what to do. He told me he was going to call Patricia and his sister and figure out a family solution. I want you to understand what a family solution looked like in the Whitfield family, because it's relevant. It looked like a group chat where everyone agreed something needed to be done and nobody did anything, because everyone was waiting for someone else to be the one who actually wrote the check. Patricia's contribution to the conversation, when Connor called her, was to ask whose fault this was. Connor's sister's contribution was to suggest they look into their options, which is a phrase people use when they have no options and don't want to say so. I had options. 6 months earlier, my grandmother Helen had passed away. She'd been careful with money her entire life, the kind of careful that comes from growing up with very little of it, and she'd left me a modest but real inheritance. $180,000. It was sitting in an account, and I had been planning to use some of it eventually for a down payment on something, someday, the vague someday that young couples talk about. I told Connor I could cover it. All of it. The arrears, and enough to pay off the second mortgage entirely so this never happened again. He cried. I want to say that clearly, because it's important for what comes later. My husband cried with relief and gratitude, and he meant every bit of it, and for a long time, that gratitude was real and present in our marriage. But here's the thing about my job. I read documents for a living. And even in that moment, sitting at the kitchen table with my husband crying with relief, some part of my brain, the part that spends 8 hours a day looking at recorded instruments, was already doing the thing it does. I told Connor I wanted to do this properly, not as a gift. As a loan, secured against the house, the same way a bank would do it. A promissory note for $180,000. At a modest interest rate, with a deed of trust recorded against the property, repayable on sale, refinance, or in 10 years, whichever came first. Connor didn't object. I want to be fair to him here. He didn't think it mattered either way because he loved me and we were married, and in his mind, what was the difference? But he signed it because I asked him to, and because some part of him, I think, understood that I was protecting something even if he couldn't have told you what. We had a real estate attorney draw it up properly. We signed it properly. And I drove it to the county recorder's office myself, on my lunch break, because that's the kind of thing I do, and I recorded it the same way I record other people's documents every single day of my working life. $180,000 deed of trust, in my name, attached to the title of the house on Maple Street, public record. Permanent. The kind of document that doesn't go anywhere unless someone specifically files paperwork to release it. I never told Patricia about it. Not because it was a secret. It wasn't. It was recorded at the courthouse, available to anyone who looked, the same way Cassidy's mother's deed was in a story I watched once and recognized something of myself in. I didn't tell Patricia because Patricia had made it clear, in the kitchen, on day one, that financial conversations involving me were not conversations she considered herself part of. She thought the house had been saved through some vague family resilience. Connor's sister thought a relative had helped out. Patricia, as far as I ever knew, never asked the specific question of how the mortgage that was 12 days from foreclosure suddenly wasn't a problem anymore. I want to tell you about the years that came after, because they're the part of this story that explains why I was willing, 4 months ago, to sign away my interest in that house without a fight. The gratitude faded. That's the honest version. Not all at once, and not entirely, but the way gratitude does in long marriages, it became background, and then it became something closer to entitlement, the quiet assumption that of course things had worked out, because things generally worked out, because I was the kind of person things worked out around. Patricia's comments continued. Visiting became a sort of running theme, never said outright again after that first day, but present in the way she talked about the house. When Connor's grandfather built this place, this house has seen 3 generations of Whitfields. I hope you understand what this house means to this family. All of it delivered to me, specifically, in the gentle tone of someone explaining something to a person who couldn't be expected to understand it because she hadn't grown up Whitfield. I'd renovated the kitchen myself, 3 years in, with money from my own savings, because the original counter from Connor's grandfather's era had a crack that was getting worse. Patricia, when she saw it, said it was lovely, and then said in the same breath that she was glad they'd kept the cabinets because the cabinets were the part that really mattered. We had a daughter, Sophie, 5 years ago. Patricia adored her, genuinely, completely, in the uncomplicated way grandmothers sometimes manage even when they're complicated about everything else. That was real, and I never wanted to take it away from either of them, and that fact ended up mattering more than I expected later. The marriage itself started to come apart around the time Sophie turned 3. I won't spend long on this, because it's not the part of the story that matters, but I'll say that Connor, somewhere in those years, started disappearing into himself in a way that eventually included disappearing to other places, with other people. And by the time Sophie was 4, we both knew where things were heading even though neither of us said it out loud for almost another year. When we finally did say it out loud, the conversation about the house started almost immediately. Connor, to his credit, raised it first, almost apologetically. He said his mother had been asking, that she'd assumed that the house would obviously stay with him with the Whitfields, and he didn't know how to navigate that with me and was sorry to even bring it up during everything else. I told him I understood. I want to explain why, because I know how this sounds. By that point, I was exhausted. Not from the house, from everything. From years of being the person who fixed things while being treated like the person who was lucky to be allowed near them. From a marriage that had quietly become something I was managing rather than living inside. From a mother-in-law whose love for my daughter was real and whose regard for me had never moved past visiting in 8 years. What I wanted, more than the house, more than anything connected to Maple Street, was to be done. Cleanly, quickly. With Sophie's life disrupted as little as possible, which meant primary custody and staying in the school district, which meant, practically speaking, me finding a different place to live nearby rather than fighting over a house I'd have to sell half of anyway. So when our attorneys worked out the settlement, I agreed to quitclaim my ownership interest in the house to Connor. In exchange, I got primary custody, the retirement account split in my favor to account for the house, and a settlement that on paper looked generous to me and looked, to Patricia, like exactly what she'd always said would happen. The house would stay with the Whitfields. If you're watching this and you've ever been so tired of a fight that you gave up something valuable just to be done with it, and you're starting to suspect there's a but coming, you're right. Stay with me. Hit subscribe because the courtroom is next, and so is the part Patricia didn't see coming. The court date was a Tuesday morning in February. It was not dramatic in the way these things sometimes are in movies. It was administrative. Quiet. 2 attorneys, a judge who had clearly done this several hundred times, and the specific bureaucratic hush of a room where people's entire lives get reduced to paragraphs. Patricia came. I hadn't expected her to, but Connor told me later she'd insisted. For Sophie's sake, though Sophie wasn't there, and there was nothing for a 5-year-old to attend. I think Patricia came because she wanted to see it happen. She wanted to be in the room when the house, finally, irreversibly, became fully and only Connor's, the way she'd apparently always believed it should have been. The settlement was read into the record. My attorney confirmed I understood I was relinquishing my ownership interest in the property at Maple Street. I said yes. I signed. It took maybe 4 minutes. I heard Patricia, behind me, exhale something that was almost a laugh. Not cruel exactly. Triumphant. The sound of a woman who had spent 8 years certain of an outcome finally getting to watch it confirmed in writing, with a judge's signature on it. I didn't turn around. I want to tell you what I was thinking in that moment, because it's the whole story. I was thinking about a folder. When my grandmother Helen passed away, along with the money, she'd left me a small leather document folder, worn soft at the edges, the kind of thing she'd kept her own important papers in for 50 years. I'd started using it for mine. Insurance documents, tax records, and 8 years ago a copy of a recorded deed of trust for $180,000 secured against a house on Maple Street in my name. I had quitclaimed my ownership interest in that house. I had not touched the lien. Liens don't follow people. They follow property. A deed of trust recorded against a house doesn't disappear because the owner changes, and it doesn't disappear because the person who holds it signs away something else entirely, like an ownership interest in the same property. Releasing a lien requires its own document. A specific one, recorded separately, signed by the lien holder. I had never signed one. Nobody had asked me to. Patricia laughed behind me in that courtroom because she thought I was walking away with nothing. I was walking away with the house on Maple Street still owing me $180,000, plus 8 years of interest that nobody currently living in it knew about. I want to be precise about something because I think it matters. I did not do this on purpose, in the sense of planning a trap. I had recorded that lien 8 years earlier for the same reason I do everything, because it was the correct, careful, professional way to document a large loan, and once it existed, releasing it would have required me to actively do something, sign something, drive to the courthouse again, the way I'd driven there the first time. Nobody asked me to do that second thing. And I had, somewhere in the exhaustion of the last 2 years, simply never thought about it, because in my head, the marriage and the lien were the same era of my life, and I was closing that whole era at once. I drove home from that courthouse and sat in my car in the driveway of the small rental Sophie and I had moved into, and I thought about the folder, sitting in a drawer in my new bedroom, and I felt something I want to describe carefully because it wasn't triumph. Not yet. It was closer to the specific stillness of realizing a fact exists, fully formed, waiting, the way facts do. I didn't tell anyone. Not Connor. Not my own attorney even, because there was nothing to tell, no action to take. The lien existed. It had always existed. It would continue existing until someone did something about it, and that someone wasn't going to be me, because it had never been my job to manage that house's finances. It had only ever been my job to fix them, once, 8 years ago, and to make sure that fix was written down somewhere permanent. Comment below if you've ever found out, after the fact, that something you did carefully and quietly years ago was still working long after everyone had moved on. Then stay with me, because 4 months later, Connor called me, and he did not sound like a man who'd won anything. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Here is how it actually settled, because I know you want to know. 4 months after the divorce was finalized, Connor called me on a Thursday evening, after Sophie was asleep. His voice had a specific, careful quality I recognized from years of marriage, the sound of a man working up to a question he didn't want to ask. He told me he and Patricia had been talking to a lender. He'd been planning to refinance the house, partly to lower the rate, and partly, he admitted, because Patricia had offered to help him buy out some other family obligations, something to do with his sister's share of an inheritance from Connor's father, and consolidating it into the house made sense for everyone. He told me the title company had come back with something unusual. There was a lien on the property, a deed of trust, $180,000 recorded 8 years ago in my name. He asked me, very carefully, if I knew anything about that. I told him I did. I told him it was the loan I'd made 8 years earlier when the house was 12 days from foreclosure, the one his father's second mortgage had created, the one I'd covered with my grandmother's inheritance, the one we'd both signed for and that I'd recorded properly at the courthouse, exactly the way it was supposed to be done. There was a long silence. Forgot about that, he said. I know, I said. He said, and I could hear underneath it the specific dawning math of a man realizing what 8 years of accrued interest on $180,000 actually came to. The settlement, you signed away the house. I signed away my ownership interest in the house, I said. That's what the document said, that's all it said. I read it before I signed it. It's my job to read documents, Connor. Another silence. Then, quieter. Does my mother know about this? I have no idea, I said. I never told her. I never had a reason to. He asked me, and I want to give him credit. He asked carefully, not accusingly, whether I'd release the lien, whether we could work something out. I told him the same thing my attorney would have told him if he'd asked her instead. The lien was a real debt, properly documented, with interest that had been accruing for 8 years at the rate we'd both agreed to in writing. If he wanted it released, the debt would need to be satisfied. That was how liens worked. That was how they'd always worked. I hadn't changed anything. I'd simply stopped being the only person who remembered it existed. Patricia called me the next day. I want to tell you about this call, because it's the only time in 8 years she ever called me directly about anything that wasn't related to Sophie. She did not laugh. She told me there must be some mistake. She told me the house had been settled. She told me, and her voice had an edge I'd never heard from her before, that she hoped I wasn't trying to get something out of this family on the way out. I told her the lien was recorded 8 years ago. I told her it had been public record the entire time, available to anyone who looked, the same way every deed and mortgage in the county is available to anyone who looks, because that's how property records work. I told her I hadn't hidden anything, because there was nothing to hide. I'd recorded a loan the correct way, the way the bank would have, the way anyone would if they understood that I'll pay you back and I'll pay you back, and here's a document proving it filed where anyone can see it. are not the same promise. You knew, she said. All these years, you knew this was sitting there. I knew, I said. The same way the bank knows about every mortgage on every house in this county. It's not a secret, Patricia. It's just paperwork. Nobody asked me about it, so I never had a reason to bring it up. There was a pause, and in it, I heard something I'd never once heard from Patricia in 8 years, which was the sound of a woman recalculating, in real time, a story she'd been telling herself since the day I walked into that kitchen. This house, she said, and her voice had lost its certainty, has been in this family for 3 generations. It still is, I said. I never asked for the house, Patricia. I asked to be paid back for the loan that kept it in this family in the first place. Those are 2 different things. They've always been 2 different things. I just don't think anyone in this family ever read the part where I wrote that down. I want to tell you what happened next, because it's not dramatic, and that's exactly why it matters. There was no scene. No courtroom this time. Connor's attorney and mine exchanged a series of careful letters over about 6 weeks. The lien, with 8 years of interest at the rate we'd agreed to, came to just over $211,000. Connor and Patricia, between them, had the resources to satisfy it, mostly through the refinance Connor had already been planning, which now had to account for a debt nobody had budgeted for. They paid it. There wasn't really another option that didn't involve selling the house, and selling the house was the one outcome Patricia had spent 8 years organizing her entire worldview around preventing. I received the funds in May. I used them, along with my share of the retirement accounts, as the down payment on a small house 2 streets over from Maple Street, close enough that Sophie's walk to school barely changed, with a kitchen that has a counter I picked out myself, that nobody before me ever ran their hand along while telling me not to get too comfortable. I see Patricia occasionally, at pickups and drop-offs for Sophie. She is polite now, in a careful, recalibrated way, the politeness of someone who has had to revise a long-held opinion and hasn't quite decided what to replace it with. She still loves Sophie completely, and I have never once made that complicated for either of them, because that was never the part of this I wanted to change. She has never said the word visiting to me again. I don't think she will. Connor and I are, honestly, better now than we were in years. The thing about a marriage ending over money you didn't know was owed is that it clears the air in a strange way. He told me, a few weeks after everything settled, that he'd looked back through old emails and found the original loan documents, the ones he'd signed 8 years ago without really reading, sitting in his inbox the whole time, exactly where they'd always been. I should have read it, he said. Most people don't, I said. That's sort of the whole point of my job. If I leave you with one thing, let it be this. If you do something generous for people who don't fully see you, document it anyway. Not because you expect to need it. Not because you're planning for the relationship to end. Document it because that's simply the correct way to handle a real financial transaction, regardless of who you love or how permanent it feels in the moment. The people in my husband's family spent 8 years certain that the house on Maple Street had been saved by some vague family resilience, and that I was lucky to be allowed to live in it. They were half right. The house had been saved. They just never read by what. A piece of paper, filed correctly, outlasted an entire marriage's worth of being underestimated. It always will. That's my story. $180,000. A deed of trust nobody read. And a laugh in a courtroom that I let happen, because I already knew how the rest of it was going to go. If this reminded you that the quiet, careful thing you did right matters even when nobody notices it at the time, take that with you today. Share this with someone who's ever been told they were just visiting in a place they helped save. Drop a comment below and tell me what you'd have done differently or the same. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.